Travel and Transportation in Early 19th Century New England by Tom Kelleher. About the presentation. In early 1800s, America was in the midst of transportation revolution, and New England led the way. This overview, illustrated by PowerPoint slides, will outline some of the innovations and changes that put the whole population in motion in the first several decades of the 19th century. Tom Keller is historian and curator of mechanical arts at Old Sturbridge Village for the last 30 years. He regularly teaches and demonstrates at museums and historical societies around the country. Tom holds a master's degree in history from the University of Connecticut and writes for many magazines and journals. If you have a cell phone, would you please turn it down? Well, we won't have any disturbance because we got taping this tonight. Okay, thank you very much. Tom, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody. Okie dokie. And I want to thank Chris for adding some local flavor to this for me. Anyway, in the waning decades of the 1700s and the first several decades of the 1800s, after the American Revolution, there were a lot of other revolutions going on in the United States, and especially in New England, including, as Eric said, a transportation revolution with things really dramatically speeding up. But that went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, the increasing making of things for distant markets by divisions of labor and machinery, not necessarily one or the other, and a commercial revolution selling all those things around the world and bringing in things from around the world, increasingly becoming the consumer society that we are today. The political revolution of increasing the franchise, eliminating property requirements for voting, and having a more on the way to a more democratic society, and the social revolution that went hand in hand with all these other revolutions, all the rules of how to live your life and what to do to earn a living, and we're changing. And for some people who got it, it was a wonderful thing, and for a lot of people who were used to things the way they'd been, it was very disconcerting, which led to all sorts of problems, including rampant alcoholism. A lot of people face all these changes by climbing into a bottle. The average American was drinking more than 3 times as much alcohol as the average American drinks today in the early 21st century. Yeah, wow, indeed. So, yeah. Anyway, but the better transportation led to a lot of things. Of course, the easier, cheaper, and increased movement of both goods and people. Better communication, since in a pre-electronic age, information usually traveled at the speed of a horse. Stagecoaches, for example, usually got the contracts to carry the United States mail, which is the main way people had of communicating over longer distances. The improvements in transportation allowed for specialization of both industry and farming. A lot of things got concentrated in certain areas. Massachusetts, for example, got really big into the manufacturing of shoes, but different parts of Massachusetts did other things. North Brookfield especially was big into making shoes, very cheap shoes, for sale to the American South, to be put on the feet of enslaved people, whereas Lynn, a big shoemaking town, was more making women's shoes, and so forth and so on. Some areas specializing in making cotton textiles, some in woolen textiles, and various and sundry other industries. Also, farming got specialized. Certain areas catered to doing truck farming, in other words, growing a lot of vegetables for increasing urban areas that were growing up with all this manufacturing and commercialization. And you also have the growth of large corporations and banks. Part of that changing rules, putting more money into circulation so people could engage in all this commerce. And also the idea of pooling capital with corporations. Back then you had to have a special act of the legislature to form a corporation, which in legal terms, of course, is an artificial person that doesn't die. most businesses were still simple proprietorships where a person owned it and was completely responsible for it, instead of having people just put in shares and insulating their involvement with the business. But that's not what this talks about, just sort of a tangential thing. But that meant for more commerce and more movement of people around. Instead of staying where you were born, more and more opportunities increase for people to be on the move, hence more transportation. And like I said, more social changes for better or worse. And with the transportation, speed was picking up in this period. One historian has observed quite rightly that speed is the only uniquely modern sensation. Think about it. Throughout human history, even though every generation thinks they discover sex, every speed is the only thing that people today routinely experience. We think nothing of driving down the Mass Pike over the speed limit. We think nothing about getting on an airplane going 500 or more miles an hour. The only person who went faster than like on a galloping horse was somebody who fell off a cliff, and they didn't learn to tell the tale to anybody. So anyway, even more so than today, travelers 200 years ago, who went any real distance, went by a combination of means. If you want to drive somewhere, your driveway connects to every other driveway in the United States, if you think about it. And it connects to every paved road in the United States, which is mind-boggling, and most of Canada and Mexico, for that matter. So you can just today just get in your car and go anywhere. But if you travel long distances, most people today, either take an Uber or they drive themselves to the airport, and then they get on a plane, and at the airport they might get on a shuttle to get from one terminal to another, and then you got to get to the city you're at, either rent a car, get an Uber, somebody picks you up. You might take public transportation if you're going to a big city like New York or Boston. There's a combination of ways people get around, even more so then. Just for a couple examples, a young girl in 1836 named Caroline Fitch kept a diary. She illustrated it. I think this is a nice illustration of her trips. That's her drawing of Lyme, New Hampshire. But she traveled with her parents from Boston to New Hampshire. They took a railway from Boston to Lowell, as far as they could. And then they took a steamboat from Lowell to Nashua, New Hampshire. And then they took a stagecoach to their ultimate destination, the hotel at Lyme, New Hampshire, which he nicely drew here for us. And keeping travel journals. If you took a trip, a lot of people, like Caroline, like this fellow here, John Steele, would write down their trip. Sometimes it doesn't make very fascinating reading, sometimes it does. But Steele was a very meticulous fellow, and he was born and raised in North Carolina, moved to New Hampshire, made a whole lot of money, and decided in 1838 to travel from New Hampshire back to where he was from, to sort of meet old people, old friends and family down there, brag to them how prosperous he was, and then go back to New Hampshire. But he calculated that this trip that he took to Salisbury, North Carolina, that he walked for 40 miles of the trip. He was in a one-horse wagon, paying for the privilege, 43 miles, two-horse wagon for 4 miles, 48 miles in sleighs, stagecoaches for 537 miles, steamboats for 664 miles, railroads for 968 miles. Most of the railroads then were very short haul, point A to point B, not long-distance railroad. And he spent $355 to travel those 2,304 miles. And as you can see, almost $250 was for the actual traveling, whereas food and lodging was another $100. And he had washing and other expenses for just under $10. When you think that comes to about 7.5 cents a mile, or $4.62 a day. But to give you a perspective, a woman working in a textile factory 6 days a week, 12 hours a day at that time, was making $2 a week. And a woman doing domestic labor for pay was making half that. Now, men were making more. A man cutting hay in July might make $1. A man splitting firewood in the winter might make 50, 60 cents. So this is expensive. Travel is expensive, even more so than today, I dare say. I love these little maps that show how in the first in the 19th century, I've got more in here, how you could travel farther and farther. It's based on New York, but of course that's not that far from here. But you can see you don't get very far from New York in one day in 1800. If you're traveling over land for any distance in 1800, you're mostly going on feet, either your feet or horses' feet. And so people traveled on water, as Steele did, as much as he could, on up and down the coast, on rivers, across lakes, because it was easier. Overland travel was much easier in winter when we had paved roads, paved with ice and snow, but paved nonetheless. But you can see how in 1800 it would take up to 6 weeks just to get to, say, where Detroit is today. 6 weeks to get to Detroit. You know, you can fly there in less than 6 hours today. But you can see by 1830, with improved roads, just plain better roads, that you could go on with wheeled vehicles, and the increasing building of canals, and then to steamboats, you could travel much farther, much faster, and we'll keep this going on. And by just on the eve of the Civil War, from New York, you could get halfway into Ohio in a day. And you can get, as you can see, much, much farther. But as you get into the less populated by Euro-Americans areas of the country, travel slows down considerable. And it also depends on the direction you're going, whether the rivers cooperate or not, for example. But by 1930, with transcontinental railroads, it still is only about 3 days to California, 4 days all the way to, say, San Francisco. Well, 3 days and a couple hours, I guess, if you look at the map. But you can see that with railroads, you could get into from New York to, say, the northern part of Florida, or all the way out to Chicago, with 1 day's travel. But this is why a lot of travel didn't work out. If you were anywhere today, I mean, I work at Old Sturbridge Village, as Eric said, and you know, we've got dirt roads. They're very well maintained dirt roads, but they're not quite this muddy, but they're blessed muddy. And it was routine, especially this time of year when you got thaws, and for the next month or so, to have wagons literally up to their axles, and sometimes the horses up to their chests in the mud, which slows things down considerable. There's another one. They're kind of stuck. So anyway, but like I said, usually transportation went on a number of different means. I like this genre painting of a hotel. I think it's in Pennsylvania by all the stone, but I think you also have the happy little frontiersman there. But you have a stagecoach. That's what the larger wagon with the multiple horses is. And then you have a, since it's Pennsylvania, it's probably a Conestoga wagon heading west. And again, the frontiersman who's a pedestrian for all this. But stagecoaches were increasingly popular. They call them stagecoaches because they stage fresh horses every 10, 15 miles along the route. That's how they make better time. If you use a horse all day long, the horse gets tired, the horse gets thirsty, the horse gets hungry, and you don't go as fast. But if you can use a horse for an hour or two, wear them out, and then put on fresh horses, you can travel a lot faster. In the same way that space flight has rockets and stages. So when they get tired, they get rid of the tired part of the rocket and go on higher with more stages. But that's what they're doing with horses, and that's why it's called a stagecoach. It's organized, the lines organize way stations along the way, stage stops, where they have fresh horses owned by the stage line. It doesn't like they have to go to the whole hassle of buying horses. But anyway, but dirt roads are how people travel. We have public roads maintained by towns, by counties, sometimes larger larger government entities, but mostly town roads. And you also have private roads, turnpikes, and highways. They're called turnpikes because you have toll keepers' houses like this, where the road runs through, and they have a gate to stop you, and you got to pay toll depending how many horses you have, what kind of vehicle you have, if you have a vehicle, if you're driving livestock through. Here in Shrewsbury, an innkeeper and developer of a stagecoach line, Levi Pease, tried to get the permission from Massachusetts to build a turnpike from Boston out to Worcester. You can see this here, the toll gate. So that's why the toll keeper lives there, and when somebody comes by, they've got to pay toll, and then they turn the gate there. That's why it's called a turnpike. You turn that to get through. They also have what are called shun pikes. Clever people realize that you make a little road that goes behind the toll keeper's house, not directly behind it, but and then you go on some not very well maintained road for a short distance, and then get back on the turnpike and miss paying the toll. I mean, when I was growing up in southern Connecticut, back then the Connecticut Turnpike had tolls fairly frequently, and there was a toll in my town. My parents never went through that toll. They'd always go back roads to the next town, either direction, and went there. I mean, truthfully, to this day, I don't go down there very much, but I usually go the back way Mom used to go, because that's the way I know to go, rather than, take the road, even though the tolls have been gone in Connecticut for, 30, 40 years. Anyway, and this is 100 yards that way, if you haven't seen it. It's right next to the do not enter sign for the exit road from the parking lot here. This is a milepost that was carved in 1767 along the post road for the mail carrying from Boston. It originally was where the ramp for I-90 is, but they moved it here to your town common to protect it better and let people see it better, because people walk on the sidewalk and are stopped at the stoplight on the common and can look and see the toll marker. So when you leave tonight, look to your left, and there it is, right next to the Civil War monument, the big obelisk. So
One of two.
yes, one of two. Thank you. Yes, there is another one, but that's the one that's right here. This is why I put it in there. Anyway, so there were other kind of roads. Some were paved, not just on the dirt. Some were what were called plank roads, where they would actually make a wooden road. They'd lay down stringers and then put down boards across them, which is fine. It gives you a nice, smooth, easy surface. The horse can go faster. Everything goes smoother. It drains water better, but they need a lot of maintenance, and usually don't get a lot of maintenance. And then when the boards start rotting and things fall down and things fall between, then it's really difficult to move along the plank road. But of course, with plank roads like this, you can go through swampy areas and keep level. So they have advantages, but they're expensive to build and expensive to maintain, and most of the time they were not maintained. There was in the early days after the Revolution what was called turnpike fever. A lot of people decided they were going to invest money and build turnpikes and collect tolls and get rich. Most of them lost the money they invested, because in the long run people love these turnpikes, but it just didn't really pay the cost of building them and maintaining them in the long run without government money. And then you had canal fever, where people started building canals, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And the only canal that ever, in the long run, made money for the investors was the Erie Canal across New York. Every other canal lost money for the investors. It brought prosperity to the area, but lost money for the investors. Same thing with these turnpikes, and these private highways. And sometimes across areas where there's enough trees, they drop trees and lay them sideways and have what's called a corduroy road, which is a good firm surface, but the problem is, all your miles of speed bumps. Yeah, what fun that must be. And again, they got to be maintained. The wood doesn't last forever. It sinks into the ground, especially with mud, thaws, and everything else. And so And so most roads were dirt. This is prisoners, hence the snappy clothing. These are prisoners working on a road because they don't just say, okay, here is a road. They do try to level it out, do try to remove stumps and boulders and things like that, and try to have the middle of the road a little higher than the edges so that water will drain off it and it becomes a little less prone to mud. But again, it is a lot of work. Here's a road crew here in Shrewsbury, probably about 140 years ago, I'm guessing. It looks like they're pulling a big boulder out of a road with that tripod winch and posing for the camera. But anyway, yeah, it's an awful lot of work to maintain roads. But the nice thing about a road is, like I said, like you can see in this picture, you can use wheels. You know, you have a smooth enough, level enough, most of the time dry enough surface that you can use wheels. And a horse that can carry a few hundred pounds on its back can pull a couple thousand pounds in a wagon. And of course, if you then flood the road without mud but make it into a canal, that horse can pull 10,000 pounds or more. So it's a multiplier. But of course, a lot of people that are using the roads, a lot of people just walking, a lot of peddlers. That's part of that commerce. Some peddlers in wagons, but an awful lot on foot, walking around selling things door to door. The Amazon of the day, the store that comes to you. I mean, I've talked about, and you can see in this slide, you know, horses. Horses weren't everywhere. In the movies, it looks like every kid, you know, up until they invented cars, every kid got a horse when they turned 4. You know, all the westerns and everything. No, that's not true. I mean, I did a study of horses in not too far from here, the real town of Sturbridge, and in 1840 you had one horse for every 10 people. Half the families did not own a horse. The average household size was 8 people. And so you've got one horse for about every 10 people, but you got the people running the stagecoach line that have a barn full of horses, and you've got other people with money like the Wards here in Shrewsbury that had 4 or 6 horses. So you know that whole thing about average, you know, is how representative is it? But it's about every other family owned a horse 200 years ago. So it's not, most people, if they got from point A to point B, walked. And some people were more elegant than others for walking, but either going afoot or walking along with somebody with a horse for just sociability of it was how people got around. And there's various vehicles. I'm not going to go through every kind of vehicle on the planet. We could spend the next 7 hours here just very quickly flashing through all the different styles of horse-drawn vehicles. And I'm not going to do that. This is a very common one. It's called a pleasure wagon. It's a very light one-horse wagon. The seat is actually removable, so you can use it as a freight wagon or a passenger wagon with some luggage capacity. But it's a fairly common style of wagon in early New England. I throw in a picture of where we are here in Shrewsbury from a book that was done by an artist named John Warner Barber. It's called The Geography of Massachusetts. He's got drawings of every town in the Commonwealth and a page describing the town and what it was like. It's really cool. They've done reprints of it. He did it for other states too. He did it for Connecticut and a few other states. But I'm going to show a lot of John Warner Barber slides, but I figured I'd start with your town. And there's the church just right next to us. So anyway, here's a picture of Hubbardston with one of those pleasure wagons. And you can see the town roads, halfway rutted, but there. This thing in the middle is like a flag. That's a tavern sign. So you can see it from a distance. You know, like you can billboard signs now. You go down, unless there's zoning regulations, you go down the highways. You know, you can see the big glowing red 6 and know that the next exit there's a Motel 6. Or you see the golden arches and know there's a McDonald's. So the tavern signs were high, so travelers from a distance could figure out where they're going to stop and lodge. Not that they're going that fast, but they're going fast enough. It's good. Oh, good, a tavern. And taverns did have to have a license to be in that business. Anyway, so here's North Brookfield with another pleasure wagon. and again the state of the roads. So I mentioned stagecoaches again. That's because of staging horses. By the early 1800s, you had literally hundreds of competing stagecoach lines all through New England and New York, and there were publications that told you which line went to where, and some are competing on different routes and the times they leave and what taverns or other local landmarks they leave from and when. In the wintertime, when there's snow on the ground, as I said, the roads are paved, so a lot of stagecoach lines went to sleighs. They had stage sleighs like this one here. And there's a quote from Christopher Columbus Baldwin, who was a young lawyer in Worcester and Barre in the 1820s and 30s. He was a librarian for the American Antiquarian Society as well. But January 11th, 1835, at 7 o'clock in the evening, I went to Boston in the mail stage. In other words, the stage that had the contract to carry the mail. There were two kinds of stagecoaches you could take at the time. One was called the mail stage, which had a contract to carry the mail, and they had a timetable the government made them stick to. So if you were in a hurry, take the mail stage. But they're only going to stop to change horses. If you can answer the call of nature, maybe get something to eat or drink while they're changing horses, good for you. But if the horses are ready and you're not, tough. We got a schedule to keep. If a driver was an hour late, he got fined half a day's pay. They had incentive to keep going. They usually ran through the night as well. Horses have very good night vision, and that's what you're going for. If you see vehicles with lights on them, it's not so the driver can see, it's so other vehicles can see them. Same thing with like sleigh bells. It's so other people hear you're coming in the quiet of the snow. Anyway, but the other kind of stage was called an accommodation stage. They made accommodations for the traveler's comfort. In other words, at meal times, breakfast, dinner, tea in the afternoon, they would stop at a tavern where you could buy food and drink and have a little more time to answer nature's call. And then when it got dark, they would stop, and you could get a bed or share a bed, depending how much you had to spend and how much the tavern had accommodations for the night, instead of bouncing along in the stage. Anyhow, here in Shrewsbury, Captain Levi Pease, who was born in Enfield, Connecticut, started in 1783 with a partner the first stagecoach line from Boston to Hartford, which Enfield is kind of on the way if you know your Connecticut geography, and they had the first contract to carry the United States mail a little later in the 1780s when the Constitution was passed and the post office was reorganized under our current form of government. These are two different pictures of the same building, which is the tavern that Levi Pease eventually bought here in town and ran. He bought it in 1793 from Major John Farrar and moved to here to Shrewsbury because it was halfway between Hartford and Boston, and running a tavern, he could then entertain all the travelers overnight and make more money and sell them not only dinner but breakfast. Supper but breakfast. So it was a wise business decision for a stagecoach owner to have the tavern right in the middle of the route on a 2-day route. Smart guy. Anyway, this is the classic stagecoach most of us think of when we think stagecoach. It's called the Concord coach because they started getting made in Concord, New Hampshire, by two men named Abbott and Downing in 1827. In 1827, they made 3 stagecoaches of this distinct style, where the body is hung on leather straps called thoroughbraces. I know I got a pointer here, but I got a finger. They're long leather straps. So Mark Twain rode on one of these in California. He called this like riding on a cradle on wheels. It was kind of rocks you on those leather straps. No springs, but leather straps. But that's a distinctive style. Abbott and Downing together in friendly competition, back together again, and then their children continued making stagecoaches of this same basic style from 1827 into the early 20th century. And then the company continued to make heavy trucks until the 1930s, and then the Depression put them out of business. But it's called a Concord coach because Concord, New Hampshire is where they made them. And by the 1870s, like Wells Fargo are ordering them by the dozen and they're shipping on trains west. But here in the east, they're using them as well. And here's one, that's a Concord coach. Here in Shrewsbury in 1907. Now, by 1907, people going any distance are not traveling in stagecoaches, they're traveling on railroad cars. But the railroad depots need to bring people oftentimes to the center of town. They need people to get to the hotels. So hotels would very often buy old stagecoaches and run them as jitneys back and forth between the shuttles, if you will, back and forth between the railroad depot and their hotel. They did this at resorts as well, to get people to where they were going to actually stay rather than schlep around in the heat and all their luggage. And so for long distances back in the early 1800s, you wouldn't have ladies dressed in white riding on top of the stagecoach. But anyway, this is probably a parade anyhow by the guy sort of standing there looking at them. But anyway, so transportation was both private and public. You had privately owned horses, privately owned vehicles. You could also rent them very often because horses were not that common because you might not need that expensive horse all the time. As the guy in charge of our horses at Old Sturbridge Village says, you don't have to feed a Toyota when it's in the garage. You still got to feed the horse. And so horses are expensive. So you have private ones, but when you need one, you could rent one from a neighbor, or in larger towns, and as time went on, a livery stable, kind of a horse rental agency. Like Hertz Rent a Horse. But also in more urban areas. This one, the lower one is from New York City, but I've got one from Roxbury later on. Omnibuses, basically public transportation for intra-city travel, excuse me. And of course, like I said, winters when you've got the paved roads, and you can travel much faster in a sleigh on the smooth, slick surface of the ice and snow. And Massachusetts, if you didn't have at least 3 bells on your horse, you could be fined like $20, which is like a month's pay. So anyway, or more than that if you're a factory mill worker, but again, you don't have a horse and sleigh if you're a factory mill worker. But anyway, here's a few more pictures of animals here in town. The top one, the G.H. Warren and Sons stables, and one of the horses for rent outside. And the lower one is a farm auction, kind of like a flea market, or a state auction. But you can see all the horse wagons parked along the side of the road, like you might see at a flea market today, or somebody having a garage sale today. That's the phrase I'm looking for, garage sale. Everybody parked along the side of the road, trying to get out of the way and try to get a bargain. This is 1914, this lower picture. The top one's not dated. But anyway, accidents happen. Travel's dangerous now, travel's dangerous then. People are in a hurry, people are crowded, the vehicles fall apart, they're not always the best maintained, they're fairly fragile, they're not any heavier than they need to be, but sometimes that makes them not as strong as they need to be. Wood fails, iron fails, people make mistakes, horses get panicked. A lot of things could happen. Vehicles often tipped over. Stagecoaches often tipped over because they're top heavy.
Wow.
Yeah, this is just a rollover waiting to happen. First off, they got big wheels, so if there are ruts in the road, if there are muddy spots, they're going to ride over it. A big wheel is going to be able to get over a bump, where a little wheel will get jammed up. But that means they get heavy. Usually, the stagecoaches are made, the Concord coaches at least, the most popular, and this is the Concord coach. You can tell by the style that it's they're made in 6-passenger, 9-passenger, and 12-passenger models. Those are for people crammed inside. Somebody my girth, you're not going to get 12 of me in a 12-passenger coach. You're not going to get 9 of me in a 9-passenger coach. Most Americans then were less robust than we are today. I'll use that politely. And but they would sell as many tickets as people who wanted to ride. So if you had a 9-passenger coach, which is the most common, and there were 9 people packed very tightly inside, and somebody else came along, the 9 in could vote whether to let that person in and sit on somebody's lap, or they had to ride up outside with the luggage and the driver, and they'd sell as many tickets as they had, as people wanted to ride. So you might well get these very top-heavy things, and the luggage is high, and you don't have very much very low. And so you hit a bump, you hit a rut, going down the side of a hill, things are a little angled, they've rolled over all the time. Remember I showed you that picture of the Worcester lawyer, Christopher Columbus Baldwin, with the winter sled? A little later that year, 1835, he went out to Zanesville, Ohio to investigate some Indian mounds and some other things. He was a curious fellow. And unfortunately, the stagecoach rolled over and he was killed. Never made it to Zanesville. Wow. He's buried in whatever the next town before that is in Ohio. Anyway, but no, those were happening all the time. Another popular vehicle that people used commonly on the roads is the shay. It's spelled chaise, but it's pronounced shay. And it's a one-horse, light two-wheeled wagon. Again, the two large wheels make for a smoother ride, less obstructions. But you can see how very lightly built they are. Very lightly built. So doctors would often use them, because back then if you were sick enough to need a doctor, the doctor had to make a house call. You couldn't get to him. Or it's usually a him. So again, there's a shay going down the road with one horse. They usually did have convertible tops that could be up or down. Here's Thomas Ward's here in town at the Artemis Ward House, the biggest farm in Shrewsbury in the 1800s. Usually shays like this, like the stagecoaches, were on thorough braces, those leather straps underneath to give the passengers a little bit of a cushion. Sometimes they were on elliptical leaf springs. Sometimes shays would just have a cantilever, a wooden spring that would sort of give some cushion, but not much. And there's another shot here in town of Dr. Brigham in his gig. The gig doesn't have a convertible top. That's the difference. It's usually less well built, but another one-horse, two-wheeled cart to get from point A to point B. Here's a little bit of close-up of the doctor, and you want to guess which one's the doctor? I'm guessing the much better dressed one, holding the whip instead of the gentleman with the long hair there. I like the dog looking at what's going on. Anyway, so here's some pictures of shays going around various Massachusetts towns, and there's a stagecoach in Meriden, Connecticut. I said Barbara also did the Connecticut geography. And there's another on the far right, a tavern sign in front of a tavern. And freight wagons, you see those on the roads. Here's a picture of Brimfield Common. Obviously the flea market's not going on. But these heavy wagons moving the heavy goods, bales of cotton for textile factories, the boxes of cloth from factories, other goods being moved in bulk around the trucks of the day, if you will. There's another piled high freight wagon in Templeton. And again, you see the tavern signs and the church steeples really marking the landscape. Over on the right, there's a whole bunch of wheels. I don't know whether Barbara was trying to say it was a real wheelwright shop or some vehicle had a major accident. I don't know. I think it's probably a wheelwright shop. Somebody who built wheels. And there's a covered freight wagon going across a bridge or a road in Medford, Massachusetts. The difference between these freight wagons and the Pennsylvania Conestoga wagon is these New England freight wagons are completely square boxes. The Conestogas, which are sometimes called prairie schooners, have a curved body, so they're high at the front and back, and they're much larger wheel wagons, and the sides tend to flare on Conestoga wagons, whereas these are very rectangular and boxy. Here's Boston, where you got a bunch of different vehicles. You got the little man cart on the far right, where the guy just has a little cart with two wheels that he's pulling, and then you have a freight wagon that the driver is just walking with the horses, rather than giving them the extra weight of him to get through Boston. And you got a stagecoach in the distance up the road there. and in the foreground on the left, you've got a dray. It's basically wheels and there's a little ramp on the back where they can roll barrels on and off it. I know it's not easy to see, but I thought that was another cool wagon. And you notice that one, they've got 2 horses in line to keep it narrow, because they can get places, especially on a crowded street in Boston, that a wider vehicle can't get with 2 horses abreast. I like this one of Nantucket because it shows so much of the transportation, being Nantucket, going by water, but you still have the farmer there with his little 1-horse cart. And you also notice on the upper left windmills, for pumping water. I always like how Barbara always makes it animated by having some person in every picture pointing at something. Artistic device. Anyway, see the guy on the left there. Look at that lady. And he always had somebody gesturing. Anyway, but there's another freight wagon in Pittsfield, and there's a stagecoach coming into Lenox. And I got the guy on the horse gesturing. See, hi, how you doing? Anyway, in Salem, the stagecoach, another one of those drays with the barrels off it. And the thing on the right there, that's a town pump where people could get water for themselves or their horses. And there's Princeton, a little closer to home here. Again, the sign hanging off the tavern in this case on the left. And there's Southbridge with a freight wagon and a stagecoach. And I don't know what vehicle's in the middle of the road in the distance there. But, this one I use because on the lower right you can see a 2-wheeled farm cart and the farmer riding it, and it's being pulled by oxen, but there's a horse hitched to the front to lead the oxen. When I was in Eastern Europe 25 years ago, you'd see that every once in a while. People just using whatever animals they had. They'll pull whatever vehicle they had. But the horse goes in front because the horse is going to be faster and more in control, and the oxen are going to slow him down when he gets crazy and give him extra oomph when the load gets heavy. But anyway, here we are back to the local one at the Bartlett store here in Shrewsbury with a lot of wagons parked out front. There's a little bit more of a close-up of it. And just some more pictures of various towns with wagons. And there in Roxbury, a little more urban, not more urban today, but you've got some of these omnibuses, these public transportation, horse-drawn buses that get people around the more urban parts of our Commonwealth. And I mostly was sticking to the early 1800s as my cutoff, but I figured I'd put a few others here just to give you some local flavor. I'm guessing this is around 1900 here in town with a street railway, trolley car, moving people distances. Most of these towns had trolleys in the very late 1800s into the early 1900s. They usually around the 1930s to 50s went away because they weren't paying anymore. And there's downtown Shrewsbury with the trolley tracks by the side of the road. I mean, I grew up again in southern Connecticut, but I remember all the roads being paved, but in the center of my town there were still the steel rails for the trolley that was gone before I was there in the 1960s, but the tracks were still in the road. And there's the Boston and Worcester trolley line with the happy little conductor, engineer, I don't know who he is, but all the people packed on there. And there's Main Street again here in town with the trolley line from the opposite direction. And a picture of Sturbridge coming up from Southbridge with one of those pleasure wagons coming into town. I just have to put that in there. Anybody who's been to Old Sturbridge Village, this here is the church that's now moved to Old Sturbridge Village. So I can tell that Barbara did this drawing after 1832 when this was built, but before 1838 when this was moved to a factory village called Fiskdale, about a mile that way. This is the Congregational Church that had burned down, but it's where the current Federated Church in Sturbridge is. And the public house is down here. This is the public house. This is Sadie Green's if you know Sturbridge. Anyway, enough Sturbridge. Sorry, except for this. A lot of towns had carriage and wagon makers. Most of them were nowhere near the size of Abbott and Downing up in Concord, but there was one in Sturbridge that had, as you can see, this is probably, I'm guessing by the dress of these fellows, 1860s, 70s, where you've got about 8-10 of them who worked there. I think one or two might be just visiting. I know in 1837, the state did an industrial census. There were 4 people worked at the Haynes carriage shop in Sturbridge. Anyway, like I said, after the highway fever, there was a canal fever. Following the British example, the British had improved their roads. Of course, they went through the Industrial Revolution before anybody else. They went through a transportation revolution before everybody else. And to get around, they built a lot of canals. This is on the River Avon in England, and every one of these is a lock, a staircase to get boats from a higher level to a lower level, where they'll flood a limited area and then open the gates and let the boat down, or put the boat in, raise them to the next level. And of course, the only successful canal, as I mentioned here in America, was the Erie Canal across New York State from Albany to Buffalo, which is why Buffalo is the second biggest city even now in New York State, because of the Erie Canal going across it. The Erie has been updated several times, and a lot of it's still in business, moving ships and coal and oil and other bulk commodities across New York State. And you can also rent canal boats that are motorboats and tour the Erie Canal on your own if you want. They're like houseboats. I have a friend who did that. She said it was a lot of fun. But anyway, but there's its path from Albany to Buffalo. They're on Lake Erie. And Lockport, New York is where there's one of those big, I think it's 40 some odd locks that raise the boats considerably high. But it goes through Syracuse and the Finger Lakes, this whole area. Originally, the first sections of it went through the Mohawk River Valley. Engineering these things was a major effort at the time, and most of the white flour that New Englanders were eating after 1825, when the Erie opened, was coming from western New York on a grain boat, much like this one here, pulled by a couple of mules. And you have to, by the side of the canal, have a little level road called the towpath, where the mules walk. A lot of these on the Erie Canal, the mules would actually live on the boat, and you take them out and feed them and put them away at night, get a fresh one on, fresh one off. They'd have a little ramp they could have the mule go up and down to the towpath on. Anyway, don't want to beat that too much to death. But anyway, these canal boats were usually, they would have a tiller on the back, but they tend to be narrow. Whatever width of the canal is, fairly shallow. They usually have a cabin for passengers. Some were for passengers, some were for freight. A lot of carried both. And again, you have locks along the way to raise and lower, and they would keep speeds down. All the canals had speed limits. Usually it was at most 4 miles an hour, because the young men who are running these boats, running the horses, would try to outrace their buddies in the other boats. Boys are boys, whatever vehicles they got, they try to race. The problem with racing is not only do you get danger, but you get wake, and that eats away at the soft dirt sides of the canal and makes for a lot more maintenance. So there were speed limits on the canals. That's a wonderful picture of the canal. A little later in Schenectady, New York. It's probably around 1900 or so. And then the locks on the right, Lockport, the little staircase. And again, a little illustration of the canals. And a happy canal boat, and a little dramatic with the horses pulling it. Anyway, of course, we had our own canal here in this part of the world. In 1828, a canal was completed between Providence, Rhode Island, a deep water port, and our county seat of Worcester, right next door, the Blackstone Canal, which had a lot of hoopla, but in the long run, it lost money for the investors who bought stock in it. There's still sections of it that are, there's a wonderful park in Uxbridge about the Blackstone Canal. They've got a little museum there. If you ever get a chance, it's nice. You can go and walk sections of it. And there are 2 locks that have survived. The only one you can actually drive a car near is the Lincoln Lock. Not Lincoln, it's the Goat Lock, excuse me, the Goat Hill Lock. But anyway, it created commerce. You actually had banks founded. The Blackstone Canal Bank was one of them to put money in circulation. And there's a canal boat going along the Blackstone in Millbury, a little bit south of where we are right now. But anyway, so water transportation was a biggie, especially sailing ships. Not too much rowing by the 19th century, except for just one or 2 person boats. But sailing a lot, and steam, of course, is a upper and lower bay of New York City, very crowded. One traveler in 1836 counted 1,241 vessels in New York Harbor when he was traveling through. So he must have just counted. That's a lot of counting, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a lot of vessels, yeah. And so they're not just, crossing the ocean. A lot of them are going up and down the coast, up and down the rivers. Those are major transportation highways. I remember years and years ago studying ancient Roman history, and my professor said, we modern people think of rivers as barriers. The barbarians are going to be like this Roman history. The Romans are going to be. But rivers are transportation routes. They're highways. They're the opposite of barriers. If you're in your car, yeah, there's a barrier unless it's a bridge. But if you're trying to just get point A, point B, rivers are transportation routes. So anyway, sailing up and down, tacking up a river was possible, but going down river was real easy. You didn't even need the sails necessarily. And of course, in 1807, Robert Fulton didn't have the first steamboat, but he had the first commercially successful steamboat on the Hudson River, the Claremont, that ran between New York City and Albany, and could get upriver as well as downriver fairly quickly. As you can see, it's not a huge boat, but it's more like a ship. It's long and narrow and has the steam engine, the paddle wheels on the side to get it to move. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these river and coastal steamboats as well. Here's the steamboat Massachusetts, these things that look more like boats except with a steam engine in the middle, more like ships, I should say. But again, like the wagons, travel's risky. These steam engines often blew up because they're wooden boats with fire on them to generate the steam. They often catch fire. Sometimes they collide, but a lot of times they'll explode or catch fire, neither of which goes well for the passengers or people on board, because when they explode, there's not only all the damage and it may sink, but anyone near that is now scalded to death with hot steam. So you found accidents all the time with steamboats. International, and that really started government regulation of steam boats and steam boilers. And also international travel. That's something we all probably think of, but we still, when you're sending something today, we still call it, I'm going to ship it. Even if it goes on an airplane, a train, UPS, FedEx, whatever. We say ship it, but then you're sending anything any distance, it's going on a ship, because that's the only cheap way to send anything any real distance. And by 1838, you've got transatlantic steamship service. The first crossing the Atlantic under steam was in 1819 with a little ship called the Savannah. But in 1838, this ship, the Great Western, with auxiliary sail power, started regular scheduled transatlantic crossing, which is revolutionary. Not only could it cross the Atlantic in less than 2 weeks, as opposed to a couple months for the Pilgrims, remember? Not that you remember the Pilgrims, but you've heard the story. Anyway, yeah. Even I'm not that old. But anyway, but the point is that by 1838 you got regular transatlantic service, and so you could schedule when you're going to leave. Under sail, you leave when the moon is full, when the tide is, the moon is right, the tide is right, the wind is right, when the ship's full. But when you got regular service, we're leaving Thursday at 10 o'clock, fire up the engine. Who cares the wind's not going the right way? Let's go. And you go. And there's a a painting which is a little more colorful than the other illustration of the Great Western crossing the Atlantic, and the other little tenders wishing it a bon voyage, and little tugboats moving it around the harbors. Anyway, railroads. The first railroad in America was to get big chunks of granite out of the quarries in Quincy, Massachusetts. Wasn't for people. It was to get big chunks of stone out of the quarries. But and pulled by horses, not steam engines. But very soon thereafter, by the late 1820s, and especially into the 1830s and beyond, you start having horse-drawn railroads, because the rails have a lot less friction and they're a lot more level than any kind of road, and so you need fewer horses and get higher speed with horse-drawn railroads. Not so much for long-distance transportation, but around cities, the Metropolitan Railroad on that upper one. And again, everybody likes to be on the roof. It's like little kids. Anyway, but by the late 1820s, steam engines. The steam engines and even the rails at first are being imported from England. But after a while, America starts making its own rails and its own steam engines as well. I love this lower photograph of an early railroad where the coaches are literally stagecoaches that have been adapted for travel on the rails. And here's John Warder Barber again. I told you I showed a lot of Jordan Warder Barber. See a little kid with his hand out. Look at that, Daddy. But by the 1839 here, see how the cars are a little boxier? No, it's not so much a horse-drawn, but a distinctive mechanical railroad car. But still that kind of open engine, no cab for the engineer. But there's the State House in Boston, which is still there, and traveling across the isthmus there into Boston. There's a more colorful, stylized view of that picture I showed you before, and one of these English imported engines on the, well, they're all English imported engines, and there's just different ones. The Rocket is the one on the lower right, 1832 it says. By 1835, we had twice daily train service between Worcester and Boston. Took about 2 hours. It would cost anywhere from $1.50 to $2 for a one-way trip. So again, not cheap. You know, a day or two's pay to get from Worcester to Boston, or vice versa. When Worcester got the Blackstone Canal in 1828, they had a big party. They had a big celebration, a lot of toasting, and then just 7 years later, in 1835, when they opened the what they call the Boston Worcester Railroad, they had a toasting that to the railroad and the canal, the great links between the ocean and Worcester. The first is as weak as water. The second is as strong as steel. The railroad doesn't freeze up in the winter, and it takes a couple of hours instead of a couple of days. Increasingly, they put the canals out of business, except for the Erie, which is still running. But even there, you know, there's plenty of railroads that compete with that. Anyhow, so in 1835, you can see, like I told you before, railroads are very short haul. List short, squiggly little lines. Not much. And most of them don't connect anything. They're from point A to point B. But the railroads do grow. The engines get larger. They get more powerful. They can pull more things. But they're still mostly wood-fired. They don't get the coal till later. But by 1840, you can see a lot more, and now much more connected, railroad routes. That railroad from Boston to Worcester by 1840 is well past Springfield. And by 1841, I think, 42, it gets all the way to Albany. And as you can see, a lot of other railroads. There's also a railroad running up to Lowell that makes it from Boston to Portsmouth by 1840, and to Nashua, down to New Bedford, down to Connecticut, Stonington, Connecticut, and Norwich, Connecticut, along the way, and other ones still disconnected out here in the Midwest, you know, around Detroit and Indiana. But by 1850, you can see the railroads continue to expand and grow, especially here in the Northeast. and across the northern Midwest. And then just 11 years later, 1861, beginning of the Civil War, you got a lot more. I'll just flip back to 1850 really quick. Look at that. 11 years. Look at all that growth. Hold on. 1890. Look at that. Look how the northern Midwest and the Northeast is almost covered with red. Almost covered with railroads. Everywhere. A patchwork. And even the South is much more. And around San Francisco, you see a lot more of intensity of the railroads. And by 1919, America Railroad is at its peak with almost 250,000 miles of track. Just over 250,000 miles of track. Today, as you know, the railroads have contracted considerably. We've only got about 160,000 miles of track, but we still have more railroad mileage than any other country on the planet. Much larger than Russia, which is a much more geographically large country, much more than Canada, which is much more geographically large, China, which is about our size, much higher population, but still relying on even steam railroads in China. But anyway, but guess what? Like stagecoaches and horse-drawn vehicles, like the canals, like the stagecoaches, like the steamboats, the railroads are new and dangerous technology. You have steam engines, you have people going too fast on tracks that aren't always the best maintained, which is why we've had, of course, if you've ever ridden the T, they've just finally, after like 20, 30 years, allowed them to get to like 40, 50 miles an hour, because they always have the slowdowns because the tracks are, and people would, the thing would it'd be real easy going fast, and then the rails aren't quite, and you get this derailed. And they also have people using the same line in both directions. And it's not until the 1880s they figure out time zones like we have now. They do that for railroads. So that, because otherwise, everywhere, it's noon when the sun is directly over your head. So noon is a couple minutes different here in Shrewsbury from Warren, where I live. And so, but if you're on a train and my watch is set to where I live and your watch is set to where you live, oh, they won't be boom, boom, and they run into each other. So it's 1880, they come up with the 4 time zones for the United States now for railroads, so they can coordinate that and minimize the crashes. This is just some pictures I have. This is, I think, Grafton, a little later in the 19th century. But, you've got this kind of views all through New England. And, of course, all this stuff needs maintaining. And there's the streetcar coming through to the station. And I said I'm going to go a little past the time period. And I don't even watching the watch, so I'm going way past my time, so I apologize. But I want to finish up by talking about the dummy railroad. It's called the dummy railroad, the Worcester and Shrewsbury Railroad, one of these really short haul. It's a light railroad. Today we call it a light rail, passenger rail. It's not hauling freight. It's called the dummy railroad because they made the cars to look like those horse-drawn cars, not like the railroad cars. So the idea was it wouldn't frighten the horses that they pass on the road. But that's what they call the dummy railroad, because instead of looking like train cars, they look like horse-drawn cars. Like those omnibuses that I showed you before in like Roxbury. That's why they called it the dummy railroad. It was really called sometimes they call it, the destination was get people out to Lake Quinsigamond. Because, here's the history of it in short. The Worcester and Shrewsbury Railroad. J.J. Coburn, a Worcester businessman, had a resort he built eventually about the time of the Civil War on Lake Quinsigamond, and later, after Lincoln got shot, called it Lincoln Park. And it was, a popular place to go to get out of the city, have some recreation on a day off. And one of his early co-investors in that railroad later bought him out, and in 1905 built White City, which, here in Shrewsbury was an amusement park. But there's some tickets from the old Worcester and Shrewsbury Railroad out to Lake Quinsigamond. There were a bunch of different steamboats they could take up and down Lake Quinsigamond. This is one of the smaller ones here on the bottom that would go from Lincoln Park. And there's a picture of Lincoln Park, the boathouse at Lincoln Park. Those are little pleasure boats you could rent and go around Lake Quincy. Anyway, and then here's White City. White City was built and opened in 1905, closed in 1960. But there it is in 1908 in all its glory. You know, where the shopping center is now, of course. But probably not as practical as the shopping center, but sure looks like a lot more fun. Anyway, there we go. So, and there's the littlest railroad. There was a ride at White City called the Bay State Limited. These teeny tiny railroad that looks like even smaller than the one they have at the Ecotarium. Been to there with kids or grandchildren at some point. But yeah, the Bay State Limited, little tiny railroad. Anyway, I love this painting of Manifest Destiny because it shows all the different it shows the terrible things, what they at the time called civilization chasing the buffalo and the people dependent on the buffalo ever far west. Run away! But there's Lady Liberty leading the way, with her telegraph line. No, it's barbed wire. No, it's telegraph line that she's got in her hand. This is probably the Constitution or the Bible or something. And but you got the pioneers in their covered wagon. You got the Pony Express rider there. You got the railroad, the Iron Horse coming through, the stagecoach coming through, the little prospectors going out to go find gold, and then the farmer plowing the field that's probably not on the road, but what the heck. Still kind of cool. Anyway, so that's my little whirlwind tour of transportation. And again, thanks to Chris for some of those pictures of Shrewsbury, which I probably don't know answers to any questions you may have, but I give it a shot. But maybe somebody in the room would know the answer. So if you have a comment or question. Okay, well, there's cookies and goodies in the back room, I think, and maybe still coffee. I don't know if they'll lie. Okay, good.
Okay, thank you very
for
much.
having me.
See you next month on March 26th for the program Belva Lockwood for President by Ann Barrett. Her story takes place in 1884 when she was the first woman to run a full presidential campaign. So have a great night and see you next month.